officer have been indicted on charges which involve tax-related crimes. Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg turned himself in this morning to the Manhattan District Attorney. A short time ago, he was escorted to the court in handcuffs to face charges. That indictment has been unsealed. We now know what is in the charges: grand larceny in the second degree and scheme to defraud in the first degree. And the assistant district attorney told the court Weisselberg avoided taxes of $1.7 million, calling it a sweeping and audacious illegal payment scheme orchestrated by, quote, senior executives. Weisselberg has pled not guilty and has just left the court. There's a lot more to those charges. I want to go to NBC Justice correspondent Pete Williams, who's been pouring through the 25 pages. Tell us essentially what these accusations are.
Well, the grand larceny statute in New York is often used in these tax evasion cases, and that's basically what this is, Lester. They say that he had an apartment that the Trump Organization paid for him on Riverside Drive in New York, paid his monthly garage expenses, his utilities, and his rent, that it also paid tuition expenses for members of his family, payment on a Mercedes-Benz for him and his wife, and also received unreported cash. Failure to pay his taxes on this, and also taxes on payments made to other executives and employees. So what the district attorney is saying here is that Alan Weisselberg is a CFO, a chief financial officer. He's the one who's supposed to know how these rules and how these laws work. He's the one who monitored all the dollars that came in and out, and surely he should have known that you have to pay taxes on these kinds of fringe benefits. Now, the statute that he's charged under in New York has a maximum penalty of 15 years in prison. Obviously, if he were ever convicted on these charges, his penalty would be much less than that. It's a first offense. And a big key question for him is now, will he cooperate? Because if he cooperates, that could potentially reduce his sentence. And by, in essence, throwing the book at him here for tax evasion, that's clearly what the district attorney is hoping. All right, Pete, we understand the attorney for the Trump Organization, Alan Futerfas, is speaking to reporters.
And we're all aware, all of you and all of us are aware of the very significant financial crimes that have occurred by large financial institutions where this office did not take them on, did not prosecute them. Going back to 2008, the financial collapse of the United States, many of the firms that were involved in those events are located in Manhattan. We did not see this office go after those firms and drag them into court, those companies into court, and we're talking about $1 trillion in lost value to homeowners across the United States. So those are my thoughts, and I think that it is an improper precedent. I think the office knows this. I'm not saying anything to you all that they are not aware of, but I believe the political forces driving today's events are just that. It's politically driven, notwithstanding the statements by my colleague at the DA's office in court today.
Alan Futerfas, the attorney again for the Trump Organization, calling this political. That is a charge we've heard before and will likely hear a lot of. Hallie Jackson, our senior Washington correspondent, watching along with us. Hallie?
Yeah. Listen, this is not a surprise the way that Alan Futerfas is now out, the attorney for the Trump Organization, looking to paint this as essentially political persecution in the prosecution of former President Donald Trump. It's interesting, Lester, because he is now out there taking questions from reporters. This is a very public-facing pushback now from the Trump Organization, perhaps understanding the impact to the brand given the indictment that has just been unsealed and the charges against both the organization and its longtime CFO. This is the strategy that I have seen over the last really week since we've been seriously reporting that this could come down from those in the former president's orbit, that this is a continuation, as the former president has put it, of a witch hunt into him, that this is entirely political. And this is something, Lester, that in that courtroom just moments ago, the prosecutors tried to combat, tried to pre-butt, if you will, one of them saying that this case, the prosecutors say, is not about politics. They said this investigation, which is ongoing, is proper. They are making the case to the judge that this is not about politics, despite the claims from the Trump Organization that that is what they believe this is all about. The former president himself, Donald Trump, has repeatedly railed against the two people, the two entities leading this investigation, the Manhattan District Attorney, the New York Attorney General. There is no reason to believe that that will not continue at this point. But I can tell you, Lester, based on my reporting, despite sort of this public display of those close to Donald Trump saying, hey, this is nothing. Not nothing, but these are cars, these are apartments. This is not a huge deal. They're going after Alan Weisselberg, they claim, because in the eyes of those in the Trump organization, Weisselberg would not cooperate in giving over any, for example, dirt on former President Trump. That's the argument they're making publicly. Privately, there is a level of concern about how significant this is. I wouldn't characterize it as a freakout, if you will, but I think that there are those in the former president's orbit who understand the significance of what this could mean. To be clear, Donald Trump himself, Lester, is not part of these indictments, has not been charged, right? This isn't touching Donald Trump. This is related to people, to somebody that he's known for a very long time, and to the company that bears his name, from which he never fully divested, which was a huge issue back in the run-up to 2016, and an ethics question for him. So in that sense, this obviously relates to the former president, but he is not tied into the charges today. That doesn't mean that that is out of the realm of possibility, but if that were to happen, you're talking far, timeline-wise, far down the line on that, Lester. But certainly significant that Alan Futerfas, even as we speak, the Trump Organization attorney, is still out there holding court in front of court, Lester.
Yeah, Hallie, thank you. And criminal defense attorney and NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalas is with me. Danny, to the idea that this could go beyond Alan Weisselberg, Kerry Dunn, the assistant district attorney in court, says the illegal activity was orchestrated by the most senior executives, plural. We've only seen one executive charge here. What does that suggest?
It suggests that the senior executives included Donald Trump and other people in that high-ranking coterie. That's the suggestion. It's obviously not explicit there, but you just use logic. I mean, who else is left on the highest levels of this criminal indictment? Now, you think about holding corporations liable criminally in New York. You can do that if you show a high managerial agent committed the felony and was doing it to benefit the corporation. So who else is left beyond the CFO? And if it's, as it's reported, Donald Trump was meticulously involved in the management of his company, it seems hard to believe that, at least on some level, he was not aware of what was going on.
Let's look at what the litmus test may be as if this is political. Is this the kind of charge you would typically see given the numbers here against a company, or does it stand out as somewhat unusual?
Yes and no. New York does bring plenty of tax fraud cases. There are parts of this that are unusual. The focus on fringe benefits. There really are two stories here. The first is this is not a kind of crime that is brought very often. Normally, the IRS in the federal context, they audit, they assess, and then they collect. They don't necessarily file criminal cases in these situations. But on the other hand, going back to the Trump Organization, if it's true that Alan Weisselberg was getting Mercedes and housing and everything else that's alleged in the indictment, what in the world was he thinking as a CFO? He should have known that these are taxable events. The IRS is very strict about these fringe benefits. I mean, if you want to claim a car is something for work and not a fringe benefit, it's got to have like Bob's Pest Control on the side, and you only use it for work and occasionally to pick up groceries. Not a Mercedes-Benz that you use at your leisure, just to give you an idea. And this is something that a CFO should have known. Fringe benefits are taxable, and if you monkey around with them, you're going to get in trouble very quickly. Not necessarily charged, but in trouble with the IRS.
So is the suggestion that in lieu of a salary here, take this? Is that what they're suggesting?
That's it. You see, through the indictment are all kinds of, I would call them creative, but not particularly clever means of trying to avoid tax liability. Paying people as employees versus as independent contractors or consultants. These fringe benefits. Sometimes it was as simple as submitting expenses allegedly and just getting cash. Those are the kinds of things that we're seeing as we're reading through this indictment right now. And they seem to be, at least as alleged, a very clumsy way to avoid tax liability if they were true.
Many who are watching this had thought we would see charges related to the valuation of Trump properties for loan and tax purposes. You don't see that anywhere in here.
Not really. It doesn't mean that it won't show in some other kind of prosecution or court case. One of the things I read here is it feels like the state is going for layups here, easy shots. They're not going for three-pointers. For example, they said in open court, reportedly, we were hearing that Alan Weisselberg avoided $1.7 million in taxes. But when you look at the actual counts for tax fraud, they are of the variety of the $10,000 to $3,000 range. So I'm guessing that the state looked at, hey, this is what we know we can prove. There was plenty of other stuff here. We didn't charge the highest first-degree tax fraud, which is over $1 million lost to the government, which carries a much stiffer penalty. But they went for discrete acts that they felt very confident they can prove. That's what this indictment, the way it's worded, tells me.
All right, Danny, thank you very much. I want to bring in former U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, Joyce Vance. She's now an NBC News legal analyst. And Joyce, it appeared they were trying to put pressure on Weisselberg to, before they got to this point. Did he call their bluff? What potentially happens now?
It'll be interesting to watch this going forward, Lester, because while these charges do have a potential sentencing range that could be high, the grand larceny charge carries a sentence of 0 to 15 years. It's important to remember that particularly for a nonviolent offense with a first-time offender, in reality, there's a good possibility that Weisselberg could not be facing a significant amount of time in prison. So whether prosecutors will be ultimately successful in flipping him, he clearly resisted pre-indictment pressure, that remains to be seen. And now they'll have to methodically go through the evidence to see if they believe that there is a case that they should be trying to make against other defendants, including the former president, whether they can make it through witnesses who are already cooperating, whether they can make it on documents, or whether they come to the end of the road without Weisselberg. The other thing I think it's important to say is that these charges are fairly unusual. This sort of self-dealing off of benefits is something that you might see in a public corruption case for someone who is an elected official who is using public money to pay for his house or to pay for his clothes. They're not as common in this corporate context, and so I think we'll see a lot of strong pushback from the Trump Corporation folks.
Well, who besides Weisselberg would have the authority to allow an employee to have these fringe benefits and not account for tax collection?
I think that that's the ultimate question here. Will prosecutors be able to develop evidence? And remember, it has to be admissible evidence in court, proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Weisselberg wasn't just doing this on his own. Our common sense and what we know about how Trump ran his business suggests he must have known, but that's not enough for prosecutors in a courtroom. They will have to have evidence. It can be circumstantial evidence. It doesn't have to be direct evidence, but it must be evidence that a jury can infer that conclusion from.
Joyce, thank you. You see the cameras swinging around Mr. Weisselberg, who was released on his own recognizance. He surrendered his passport, being led from the courthouse with his defense team and into that SUV. We caught just a glimpse of him. As we know, he turned himself in early this morning here in New York City. NBC News Chief White House correspondent Peter Alexander is with us. Peter, what can you tell us?
Lester, even as you've been speaking, we've now received a statement from the Attorney General from New York State, Letitia James, describing, as you've been discussing, the sense that this is an important marker, in her words, but also part of an ongoing investigation, saying that it will continue, describing these allegations as referencing a financial wrongdoing and a scheme, again, in her words, again underscoring the point that this is the beginning, not the end of the investigation that's now been partnered between the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the New York State Attorney General's office as well. And even as the president is facing these sort of indirect allegations against those around him, Weisselberg being his chief financial officer, a man who's been involved with his company and with his family for decades now, the president is also facing real challenges back here in Washington, D.C. as well. Just today, the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, after announcing the select committee that will investigate the January 6th riot at the Capitol, the attack on the Capitol, today announced the members that will be part of that from the Democratic side, the split being 8 Democrats, 5 Republican selections. But Nancy Pelosi today announced that one of the former president's top critics, Liz Cheney, the Republican from Wyoming, will also be joining in that effort. And it comes as the president has sort of begun a reemergence of sorts. His first big rally since his departure, taking place this past weekend in Cleveland. Another one scheduled to take place this weekend in Sarasota, Florida, after his visit to the border just yesterday. The president participating in what some have described as sort of this revenge tour, in many ways targeting some of those Republicans who voted to impeach him in the past. Lester?
All right, Peter Alexander, thank you. Let's go back to NBC Justice correspondent Pete Williams, who's been looking a bit deeper into this indictment. Pete, what stands out to you?
Well, there's one tantalizing thing that I think is going to get people's interest here to try to figure out what they're talking about. They refer in the indictment to an unindicted co-conspirator number 1. They say that the defendants, the people charged here, and unindicted co-conspirator number 1 agreed with one or more persons to engage in this conduct, and later they say the Trump Corporation, acting through its agent, unindicted co-conspirator 1, underreported Weisselberg's annual income. So we'll have to try to figure out who the reference is here, whether it's someone that may be on our minds or whether it's some other official at the company.
I'm going to allow Paul Butler to have a crack at that. He's a former federal prosecutor and NBC News analyst joining us now. Paul, what do you make of this idea of a unindicted co-conspirator?
We've heard this song before, Lester. So when Michael Cohen was charged by the feds, by the Southern District of New York, there were also a reference to individual number 1, who it was fairly clear was the then president of the United States. And so this is the beginning. This is the bottom of the pyramid. And the district attorney has come close to throwing the book at Weisselberg. Charges like grand larceny are consistent with tax evasion cases, but they're also consistent with investigations of people in Trump's world looking as much like mob cases as white-collar cases. The victims named here are the federal, state, and local governments, and the criminal conduct is alleged to have spanned from 2005 until literally yesterday.
All right, Paul, thank you. And Danny, if there's a non-indicted co-conspirator here, does this suggest that we've only seen the tip of the iceberg in this case?
That is very possible. Don't forget there are several other agencies who are looking into finances. That includes the New York Attorney General. That includes an ongoing investigation. The Southern District of New York has investigated Trump Organization and Alan Weisselberg in the past. So the way prosecutors typically work is they collect and they keep pulling on threads when they find new information. And this has all the hallmarks of Alan Weisselberg being the first of many, someone that they may have felt would be the most likely to turn if they put the pressure on him. That's a possibility. But Alan Weisselberg might be one of those folks that is so loyal to Trump that even facing a couple years in prison, he'll do the time.
Cameras not allowed in the courtroom for today's very short proceeding, but our Tom Winter was inside the courtroom. Tom, you've reemerged. Now tell us how it went.
Well, Lester, just as you said, it was a very short proceeding, and it's exactly what we expected. Alan Weisselberg came into the courtroom flanked by a number of New York State court security officers. He was handcuffed. He was wearing a lightish gray suit with a light blue shirt, and he was taken into the courtroom shortly after he was into where he would sit for the rest of the proceeding. He was taken out of the handcuffs. He's out on his own today. He'll be released on his own recognizance. He's had to surrender his passport. That doesn't mean he's prohibited from traveling internationally. It just means that he's going to have to ask the court for permission to do so. There's no bail here. He pleaded not guilty along with the Trump Organization to a 15-count indictment, which overlays a scheme from what they say from 2005 up until yesterday, wherein grand larceny is charged, various things related to taxes are charged. And the heart of this, Lester, really is this idea here that people were compensated. Alan Weisselberg, and according to the indictment, other executives were compensated in a, quote, off-the-books manner. What does that mean? Essentially, that means payments in terms of an apartment, in terms of cash payments, things that were not recorded properly for tax purposes. All in all, they say Alan Weisselberg benefited $1.7 million from this scheme. Interestingly, they do lay out that the federal government was defrauded as a result of this to the tune of over allegedly $500,000, as well as city and state taxes. That's something that obviously obviously gives the Manhattan District Attorney purview to investigate this. I would describe the scene inside is very quick. It was very similar to any other arraignment of a non-high-profile case, I would say, except for the well, as it's referred to. That's where the prosecution and the defense sits. For those of you familiar with Law and Order or any other sort of court program, that was packed. It was packed with people from the district attorney's office, including Carrie Dunn, who fought so hard against Trump's attorneys to prohibit his taxes from being turned over. Dunn made arguments, including before the Supreme Court, that eventually led to those tax returns and underlying tax documents being turned over. He kind of led the way. We'll get a copy of his speech shortly and be able to share that with everybody. So that was interesting. He kind of quarterbacked the proceedings, and obviously attorneys for the Trump Organization, as well as Alan Weisselberg, in the well, along with investigators for the Office of Attorney General. That's Letitia James, and then the office that brought this case, the Manhattan District Attorney, Cy Vance. So all in all, about 15, 20 minutes in the room. And in this case now, we'll move forward. The next time we'll see the parties back in court, Lester, will be September 20th at 9:30 a.m. That's just a status hearing. We don't even have a trial date yet.
All right. Tom Witter, thank you for that color from the courtroom. Joining us again now, NBC News senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson. Hallie, we talked about the defense of Weisselberg, calling this political. But what is the immediate fallout for the former president, whether he's indicted or linked to this or not?
Well, I would say on the political front and the immediate short term here, Lester, you are seeing Donald Trump consider publicly this potential, I caution, for another run for the presidency in 2024. This is something he began hinting at almost as soon as he left office, even as he continued to lie about the results, the legitimate results of the November election. But politically, there's a couple of pieces here, Lester, because first of all, you have to remember, this is not the only potential legal jeopardy facing Donald Trump right now. Right? It is perhaps the most high profile and perhaps the most significant. But keep in mind a couple of other things. What happened this week on Capitol Hill, which is the creation of that January 6th Select Committee, which will have subpoena power. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi declining to say when asked today whether she would seek to use that subpoena power against Donald Trump. There's also what's happening in Georgia. Don't forget, there is that criminal investigation that's been opened by prosecutors there into Donald Trump and whether he tried to subvert the election results in the immediate aftermath of what we saw by making phone calls and putting pressure on officials, et cetera, down in Georgia. So there is this sort of web of potential legal issues that Donald Trump is ensnared in, even as he is making this sort of return to the public stage this summer with a number of events planned over the next several months. Politically, Lester, there's a real question mark on this, right? Because it is not people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 knew that there were questions about, for example, the way he handled his finances. That was, in effect, baked in when Donald Trump won the election. Repeatedly, he told me and others many times that he wasn't going to release his taxes, for example, because he didn't think anybody cared about them. He didn't think that the regular American people, wanted anything to do with them, wanted to see them. Obviously, prosecutors in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office wanted to see them and have them and are the only people right now besides Donald Trump who knows what's in those documents. So from a political perspective, much of what we are seeing here, at least for Donald Trump's base, is unlikely to shift the needle, Lester, in a significant way, at least as it stands right now, based on past precedent and what we've seen in the past. The question is, what does this do to his support on Capitol Hill? So far, we've seen that those Republicans who are allied with him, which is the majority of Republicans, right, almost all of them, save for a select few, unlikely to abandon him here. Lester.
Hallie, thanks. And Danny, let me just wrap up with you. Absent any political color here, from a legal standpoint, how strong does this case appear to be?
So far, just based on the allegations, this investigation involves a lot of documents. Now, people and witnesses can lie, but documents generally do not lie. And if they are alleging with this much specificity, you can bet they feel pretty confident that the documents show what they say they show. And some of these are really remarkable. I mean, I see, for example, some of these allegations where allegedly Weisselberg just had Trump Organization or Trump company issue checks. He cashed them and then just said they were for holiday expenses or something like that. One can imagine at all of our respective jobs, our employers saying, hey, instead of dealing with W-2s and paychecks, how about we just cash some checks and hand you a wad of cash? you can imagine very quickly how clumsy this may appear to be if this is all true as alleged in the indictment. Really very surprising for that kind of clumsiness, if true.
All right, Danny Savelis, thank you very much. That concludes our coverage for now. We'll have much more on this tonight on NBC Nightly News. I'm Lester Holt. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.